Oh, say Amanda. Actually, Representative Heinzman.
Oh, I just sent him an email.
Oh, you did, okay.
So that's helpful to know.
Yep, he just texted me. So.
Okay.
So are we ready, Amanda?
I'm just getting, yep, good to go.
All right, I will call this virtual meeting of the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Council Subcommittee on the call for proposals to order. It is the Halloween, October 31st, 2022, 9:32 a.m. The meeting is being held in accordance with a memo dated June 2nd, 2022 from the LCC Chair, Vice Chair regarding Commission regarding commission meetings being held remotely. You may have already seen or heard these procedures. However, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with them, members should be muted when not speaking. Use raise hand feature if you wish to speak. Click lower hand when finished speaking. We'll use a roll call to vote. You should already have accessed the materials for today's meeting on the website. We'll return to the agenda. And we have to do a roll call for attendance.
Mr. Chair, members, Hartwell.
Yep, I'm here.
Hartwell present. Edmondson.
Here.
Edmondson present. Peters.
Here.
Peters present. Eggerling. Eggerling. Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Oh, good. So our agenda is really, I'm pulling it up here on my great internet. Our agenda is to go through the criteria and ranking and decide if we're comfortable going forward or if we want to see any changes. Since I can't pull up the agenda, Amanda, can you tell us how we've organized the agenda just so I get it right?
Mr. Chair, members, if it's helpful, I can screen share it for a moment.
That'd be great, except I can't get the screen.
Oh, yes, that makes sense. I can verbally say what's the next item is for you then. So you took your roll call vote, and the next thing would be to review and approve the agenda, followed by conflicts of interest.
All right, so can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Any conflicts of interest? There being none, we'll just get right to it. Mark, I'm going to turn this over to you for a start at least.
Sure. Oops. There we go. Mr. Chair, and members, just let you know also, Josh had, I just sent him again the link, so he should be joining us momentarily. And so Amanda, just to give you a heads up on that end. Members, the call for funding request, of course, goes on each year, and the criteria that's used to, I'm just reiterating this more for the record because I think you all know it really well. But the call for funding request goes out April 1st each year. It's approved by the council generally in January or sometime before April, but generally it's December or January at our meeting. And then also the criteria that's used for that call for the members to be able to rank the different projects is approved by the council, and it's something that's it's included in the call as well. I think a year ago there was a comment, not last session, maybe it was this last session. There was a comment made in one of the bodies during a hearing that they were the powers that be. I think it was no. Basically, it was that the criteria was not open for everybody's discussion, but that isn't the case. It's always open for discussion. And it's always open for review by the council, and the council approves that criteria also. It's been probably since about 2016, maybe or so, since it's really been changed to any degree. And it was changed just a couple of years prior to that also. I think it was 15 and 17 were the 2 years, if I remember right. In 15, there were changes that were made. And then in 17, they changed them back because they just weren't working, or most of them got changed back. And it's always good to review it, and because sometimes times change. And I think we see that now. One of the last things that changed in it was a referral to the pollinator best management practices. And of course, that was something that came into law about that time in 17 or 16. And so it was reflected again then into the criteria, or the call, and consequently into the criteria. So this was an opportunity. It was brought up, the question at one of the meetings, that should we review the call, and they were interested in parties to help review the criteria, I'm sorry. And you all were the ones who volunteered to help take a look at it, besides Kristen, who is evidently coming on with us shortly. So we'll look forward to that. I see Representative Heinzman popped in and then maybe lost connection, so hopefully he'll come back in shortly. With that, Mr. Chair, any of you other members, any special way you want to handle this with regards to the review and going through? You want to do question by question? You want to just talk about concept first?
I think concept is a good place to at least start and see if anyone has anything that they would like to sort of throw out for general consideration before we get into going through it point by point, if that's all right with everyone.
Mr. Chair, from a historic standpoint, if you'd like, we could have, let's see, Sandy is with us, and of course Sandy's been along all these years, so she's seen the different reiterations. Joe is with us too, and either one of those two may have some other good feedback, or at least a more historic perspective as well that they'd like to share.
Sure.
Sandy, Joe?
Yeah, you guys might remember. I know David probably was part of this. Is in the beginning, we kind of did a statewide tour, 5 or 6 different locations throughout the state, and we took public opinions and had like kind of a town hall type meeting, and that helped form the funding priorities for the Outdoor Heritage Fund, sort of based on the constitutional requirement. So that's a little bit of the history of kind of where that came from. And then we also provided a proposal which kind of aligns questions that we ask, and the evaluation criteria sort of aligns with the questions in the proposals, which you guys probably should have seen. I don't know if that kind of gives you some background of how we got to where we were with priorities.
And Mr. Chair and members, if you go to the call for funding PDF and go to page number 5, it's got all the hearing criteria there. 1 through 10, each is scored with a maximum of 10 points. That was changed a while back too. It used to be kind of weighted depending on the question, and we changed that to 10 points each to make it easier.
Any general comments before we get into specifics?
Mr. Chair, I had a question about something that's more general.
Sure.
I was wondering if someone could talk a little bit about why the criteria are in the order that they're in. One of the things that I go through every year when we're scoring is going back and forth constantly. The questions that we get and the proposals are not aligned. And so I understand a couple questions being out of order, but I was just curious if, from a usability standpoint, if there's any possibility of getting questions maybe a little bit more in order of what the ranking is. If not, totally understand, but wanted to bring that up.
I think we can do anything we collectively want to recommend to the full council. I hadn't thought about it before, but I see no reason that we can't reorder the hearing criteria questions to align with the proposals.
That would be great. I would propose that as an option for us to consider. So that was my general comment, though.
Great. Dudley, do you have any thoughts?
Well, to me, the one thing that I agree 100% with what Ashley's saying. You do find yourself flipping back and forth. But another one for me is I find that some of the questions seem to be just a previous question slightly reworded. And that for me is, it's like, didn't I just go through this like a couple questions ago? You know, like particularly, I think it's one of the ones about, you know, species of special interest or something like that. It seems like there's two questions along those lines that are there. And so I just, my thing would be like streamlining some of the questions so that they're clearly, you know, this is this and that is that. And I don't know, that for me is one of the things. Some of the questions seem to be a rehash of another question. That's anything at all.
Great. And I see Kristen's been able to join us.
Hi
Thank
there.
you.
Sorry for the delay. I had some computer issues.
That's all right. We all seem to be having some this morning.
It's okay, Kristen.
And David, Representative Heinzman, I believe, is with us now too. I see his name on the key.
Okay, great. Glad to have you, Josh. I would just say, in terms of the criteria, there are 3 specific questions which everyone answers the same way in their proposals, and it's almost ridiculous that we're scoring against them, at least for me. I have a tough time understanding why we ask a question in a way that people can copy. You know, there's obviously collaboration between the proposers and they all come up with the same answer to the question, which makes it completely useless for me. And I don't then see in the hearing criteria that it helps us determine anything. So when we get to actually looking at the questions, I think there's a question as to why we have some questions, because they don't help me at least differentiate between proposals. And I also think just having questions that everybody answers the same way is really not helpful for us, and we should discourage that. You know, the species question is certainly one that really, you know, everyone answers monarch butterflies and mallards, and we don't learn a thing of what they're doing from their answer.
If I may ask a question on that, there are a couple of questions. One is species of greatest need and sensitivity that will be affected by this. The other is regarding how many will be produced or you know, be able to use this habitat. And then they expound on an X number per acre and so on. Is it the second, that X number per acre one, the question that you're referring to?
I think it's both. I mean, the question of what's the species of concern, we get very few that say, you know, this endangered species needs protection, and so this proposal is geared around that. They're all answering essentially the same way, with rare exception. I end up giving them all 10 because they all answer the question, and you know, it doesn't to me tell me anything, how they answer it or how we score it.
Mr. Chair, Representative Heitzman has his hand up also.
Oh, great. Thank you for letting me know. Josh?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And this could be redundant. I've been having a little bit of a connectivity issue this morning, but maybe maybe I could ask if we've asked proposers what their experience is and what their perspective is on the question that you're addressing species of concern in project presentations or in their paperwork. I might be interested in getting some feedback from them. It sounds like if they're collaborating somewhat in their answer, there's probably some background from proposers' perspectives that could be helpful, maybe. Just a thought, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, it's a good thought. You know, I think asking the proposers why they all answer the same way would be an interesting thing to hear an answer.
Right.
I guess the question would be, are we in agreement that an answer that everybody answers essentially the same way isn't very helpful to us?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I think that you're on to something. It certainly isn't differentiating one project from another. So it might be just a box that they're checking with collaboration in terms of their comments. So you're probably not that far away from reality.
Joe, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I think what we're talking about is number 5. It says proposal identifies indicator species and associated quantities this habitat will typically support. And if I remember right, that was back when there was a push for looking at outcomes. And so we were trying to figure out, you know, how many, if you buy this many acres in this area, how many mallards will you actually produce? And so remembering back to that whole discussion, there was a lot of nervousness between some of the agencies and proposers about, you know, if we say we're going to produce this many mallards or whatever that is, are we going to be held to that? Or somebody going to actually go out and measure how many mallards we're either producing or not producing? And so I think that's why you see such a generic response, is because of the leeriness of the proposers to actually commit, especially when each year, depending on weather, different factors, you could have good production, less production. There's just so many things that go into it. So I think that's why we're seeing such generic responses to that, if that helps.
Yeah, and you know, the truth is we don't go out and count the number of mallards. You know, so it's not doing the proposer any good, and it's not doing us any good. We all know that if you convert row crop into grasslands, you're going to have a positive impact on wildlife. I mean, and it's kind of, we're almost asking the question that I hated in geometry, which is, you know, prove in 2 steps that a right angle is 90 degrees. You know, it just is. Josh?
Mr. Chair, just another thought, and you know, there's only a few of us here in terms of making any kind of a decision, but have we, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Johnson, but how long has it been, or do we already do a survey of sorts that respondents could remain anonymous and have some input?
Interesting question. With regards to the criteria or the proposal, you know, it's been some
just overall input. not the proposal maybe necessarily, but if you
Yeah.
catch my thought, that it'd be interesting to get some anonymous feedback from folks that have been through this process. Just a random.
Just ask them all kinds of questions, or leave it open-ended, you mean, maybe for them, so they can really expound on whatever they like.
Just something maybe to consider,
Yeah,
talk about, think about, whatever.
yeah, because that's something that we really haven't done. We've sent out targeted surveys on different things. Whenever there's a change to the system, Sandy works with a handful of project managers to, get their feedback from different angles based on different types of work that are done and stuff. We have, even when we installed the previous criteria back in 17 or whatever, there was, again, a nice group of project managers who helped to, kind of fine tune a little bit those questions. But it's not a regular thing. So that's an interesting thing. I'll put that down. We'll try to get that done on a fairly regular basis if we can.
I'd just be really interested in the feedback we might get if those that have been through our process had the opportunity to anonymously share their thoughts.
I also like the idea of that being those who have gone through it. So it doesn't mean current, it could be all.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you there. If you meant to.
I'm sorry. I also like the idea of that being that it doesn't have to be current recipients. It could be past recipients, just people that have gone through the system at one point or another.
Exactly.
Thanks.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if there's some kind of undercurrent that drives the answers that Chair is mentioning today as being redundant. So, obviously there's communication between the respondents, that those folks have a reason. I mean, there could very well be a very legitimate argument for why they steer clear of a unique answer. I don't know, since I haven't been through that process from their perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chair, Dudley has this hand up.
Yeah, Dudley?
I was going to say in Josh's process, we also might be able to find out some of the ways in which, we have these groups that are constantly coming back and asking for, tons of money that have been coming to us for years. And we might, in this anonymous type of situation, we might find out their secret sauce or their formula for how they're, doing the things they're doing, that I feel like kind of narrows the field in terms of new applicants every year, because these folks come to us looking for, 10 and $15 million, and they might have this thing that because they've been in the system so long, they have this sort of game plan of how they ask for money and, all the things that they do. And so we might actually find out some of that as well. Because I feel like, it's not that Ducks Unlimited and Pheasants Forever or whatever aren't, great organizations to send the money to, but it just feels like they're gobbling up so much money that we don't have room to, for new proposals, I guess, for lack of a better word. And so we might find something out by having them do the anonymous thing, because they know how to do the things that they do to get us to sign off on their money. So if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think there's something there, Dudley. I appreciate that.
Ashley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to comment that in thinking about the different criteria and what we're trying to achieve in terms of giving people an idea of, where they rank, where they truly rank in terms of potentially getting funding. One of the things I was thinking about is that some of these questions feel like Representative Heinzman actually just said it, that it's more of like a checkbox than it is truly like a ranking. And so is there potential for a combination of the two where maybe 2 or 3 of the questions are checkboxes to just say like, I looked over the proposal, yes, this proposal does that, because Mr. Chair, you had also mentioned that some of those questions you just give them a 10 because it's pretty much a yes or no answer as to whether they rank that or not. And I don't know if that's possible to have basically a yes or no kind of checkbox, but something to help make the questions that truly are more of a ranking have more sway on how much you end up, like the score you end up giving a proposal. Hopefully that all makes sense. Mostly just wondering if there's a possibility to play with yes and no check boxes versus like the actual numbers ranking.
We can certainly do that. The question would be if I check the box yes and you check the box no, what does that mean when the final tally comes out in terms of how do we score that? We're really trying to use the scoring criteria to decide whether or not we want to invite someone to a hearing. And so I'm trying to think if you get, 3 yeses and 9 no's, does that mean you don't hear them? Or does it mean you have a discussion? I'm thinking out loud.
No, that's, I think some of these questions though are posed in a way where they feel like yes or no questions. And if you were to answer no, then this proposal probably shouldn't be in the pile. For example, if you've not identified, how this leaves a legacy for Minnesota. So maybe it's a rewording the question itself to make it more, to make it easier to answer in a way that's more than just yes or no, but at least, so there are several questions, I think, especially the beginning 3 to 5 questions, sometimes feel like yes or no questions to me in terms of, did this proposal do this thing? And if it's no, then honestly, it probably shouldn't be in front of us, but happy to discuss more on that.
Yeah, I find question 2, 3, and 5 very difficult to score in anything but a yes/no basis. It's sort of a 0 or 10.
Right, same.
And maybe we just don't ask those questions. Maybe we ask questions that we actually get we get answers that are helpful to us, because they're, try to read the proposal to determine whether or not they meet the criteria in proposal 3 doesn't do much for you.
Yeah, I agree. We want to make sure, right, that those things are being considered, but just because they're in the proposal as a question, and for us to look at and read through doesn't necessarily mean that they are part of what we use to score the proposal. And maybe that just needs to be clarified. But I'd be open to adjusting which questions or how the questions are used to help get actual scores that are 1 through 10 versus, what you just said, which is, it feels a lot like yes or no answers.
Mr. Chair, question for you. Was that questions 2, 3, 5 that you brought up specifically?
Those are the ones that I struggle with. I also struggle with 4 lists targeted species, because we don't get any, 95% of the time we get an answer like mallards or monarch butterflies. We don't get it's so generic, it's not helpful.
Okay. Mr. Chair, Representative Heinzman has his hand up.
Yep, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of things. Number one, this feels like, and you can correct me, Mr. Chair, if I am getting the wrong drift, but and maybe this was the intention of this meeting, I'm not sure, but is this a bit of a small group editing process today? Because, and I know that we have a few members here, but very few. Not exactly, and I missed the beginning of the meeting because of the connectivity problem. I didn't have a link to today's meeting. I guess that, along with, I feel that we're asking a lot of questions that those that have been through this process could probably answer. And it would make sense to get some feedback so we know the answers to the questions you're asking, Mr. Chair, because they're good questions. Like, why are respondents collaborating on certain questions to have a somewhat generic response? If we're editing our process today without getting feedback first, it seems like a little bit of the old adage, the cart is before the horse. So does anybody else have any thoughts on this? Because it seems a little odd.
Dudley, you had your hand up. Is that?
Yeah. I guess to Josh's question, I don't think at least I don't feel like we're doing anything other than asking questions today and nothing more. And I also feel like the questions that you've pointed out do seem to be difficult for us to answer, and perhaps they're obviously difficult for the applicants to answer too, because that's why they have these generic answers. So I guess maybe Josh's point that maybe we should get feedback from them might answer the question for everybody. And then if we need to edit and condense and combine some of these 1 through 5 questions into 1 or 2 questions, we'll at least have that information from participants that, it helps them and it helps us.
Yeah, I have no objection to asking, how others view the process and the questions. I think on some level, maybe we need to ask them why they all answer the same way. And what that process is to get to that. It'd be interesting to know what conversations they all have with each other and emails they send back and forth to get to the same place and why. Ashley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To answer the question about the meeting today, my perception was today was a way for council members to collect some of our thoughts and collect some questions so that we have an understanding of where council members are right now in terms of looking at the criteria and understanding the questions. I see this as the beginning of this process that we will certainly take steps, I would assume, to include folks in answering some of the questions that we discussed today. So that was my understanding.
Yeah, I don't think this is the last conversation we'll have. Josh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just adding to that. It sounds like my impression of the conversation here today is fairly accurate. So, there's nothing wrong with kind of going through this process. That makes sense. I do think that moving forward with any kind of decision making before hearing back from those that are coming to us with these proposals would it would benefit us all as members to hear their perspective before we were to make any kind of a decision. That's why I would continue to suggest that we would go to them with some kind of a survey of sorts to get their input. There may be questions that come up today that would be included in that. So it looks like Mr. Johnson has a thought relative to that. So I'll go back here.
Great, Mark.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, and I think everybody's coming with the same anticipation that staff has here, that this as a subcommittee, the subcommittee can make recommendations to the council, or as a committee of the council, they can make recommendations to the council. And but I'm thinking too that you may want to have us get certain information or potentially change some questions or whatever it might be out of this meeting, and then have another meeting prior to the December meeting, so that we could actually, you'd have a chance to see what we come up with, or what that feedback from the project managers is, and maybe even anonymous feedback at that time. We could probably whip that through in a couple of weeks' time. Our biggest requirement will be just setting a date for another meeting if you wish to go that direction, so that we have proper notice to the public under the open meeting law.
Yeah, I would encourage us to both do the survey and have another meeting before our December meeting. You know, the truth is that we can do this at the January meeting too, because the call for proposal doesn't need to go out before the January meeting. So we have time to get this right. Dudley?
Yeah, one other point I wanted to bring up about the application, I think to Ashley's earlier point, as far as aligning everything so that the two documents sort of match up, so that you go through them and you know, one is one on both or whatever. But the other thing that I mentioned at one of our last meetings was, I feel like people get asked a question, but they don't get graded on it in this process. And the diversity inclusion was one of those. So I feel like that if it's on the application and they have to answer it, then they also need to be graded on it. And we don't, it seems like there's some things that we grade on and some things we just ask the question. And because I know that the diversity inclusion is question, no one gets graded on that 1 through 10, that I'm pretty sure that's not the case. And so I feel like the two should match in that way, where if someone asks you the question in the application, then you also need to be graded on your answer. And that is at least one question I know that people don't get graded on.
I don't disagree with you. I think the complexity is there are tons and tons of questions that we don't grade on directly. And, you know, we don't grade on the question, will E's land be open for public use? And yet we ask the question. And so I don't want to have 100 questions that when I go through and rank proposals, I've got to get the answer to every single one. But your point of sort of broad, you know, things like the diversity question, I think we should be asking as part of our criteria. The challenge we have in the end is, how does it all tie to the constitutional dedication for which the funds are used? And, you know, if you read the Constitution, it says nothing about public access in any place other than land acquired in fee has to be open for for the taking of game. There are things that inform our decision that aren't part of the absolute criteria by which we should be managing this process, and I don't know exactly how we resolve all of that, because we want this money to go further than what the constitutional dedication alone is, but it's not the requirement. But I'm very open to saying what other questions should we be asking. And maybe the best thing would be for all of us to, before our next meeting, go through the proposal and say, which of these do we want to see scored in some way? I don't think we can do it today, but I think it might be helpful to do that. Mark?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, is there, and members, is there a, the BIPOC question came up a couple of years ago, and we add that in there for, diversity and inclusion. There's a political, a reaction to the political environment and questions within that were coming in committee, so that we could get try to get some data back on how project managers were actually planning on this being, or hopefully planning on their projects being accessible by all, and then kind of pick up some of those other side effects too, because a lot of these projects happen, and then afterwards, there's some really cool community involvement that happens around these projects. We've been able to pick up some of that information, which is nice, but it wasn't added into the criteria from a scoring standpoint, just simply because it wasn't, hadn't been reviewed by the council from that respect, and it was not part of the statutory or constitutional directives, to follow the conservation plans, and et cetera. Do you all feel that is that still a good question for us to ask in your minds? And I see heads already nodding. And then are there other questions like that could be helpful for you all that could be asked or should be asked, even if they are not part of their criteria? And I'm going to mention one specifically. I don't know if it's a good question or not, but I know that after you all go through the projects and you rank the criteria, I often hear council members saying, yeah, this one, I had to rank it fairly high, but I really don't feel good about it. And I don't know if there's a point where you have a ranking from 1 to 5 on how do you feel about this project, and that's pretty subjective, but it gets to the point of this question anyway.
Yeah, I think not only should we be asking whether or not we're getting the answers, but the staff are the ones that are working closer than anyone else with the proposers and those that get funds. I'm interested in what you think we should be asking that we're not asking, or how we should ask questions differently, because you deal with the consequences on a daily basis. We deal with it on a completely different thing, and your perspective, I think, would be valuable, just as hearing from the proposers would have value to us. I'm sure, I know that there are things that you guys talk about that you wish we talked about, but we don't. And I'm curious what they are.
Mr. Chair and members, I think I'll just talk about from my perspective is I think we've gotten to a point that that I feel we're pretty good with the amount of information that we request. A lot of times, after I read the first page of the proposal, I want to know exactly who's doing what, where they're doing it. So I want to know what kind of land you're going to buy, what kind of land that's going to be turned into will be a WMA state forest. And then after I know that, then I know, what the future management of that parcel is going to be. And that gives me a whole bunch of information. So there's questions in the proposal that, where the proposer actually has to check, here's the type of land we're going to buy, that kind of stuff. So I think the basics are in there. And even though they're very basic, they give us a lot of information. I think the number 5, the indicator species question, I think we get answers the way that they are given to us because there's only a certain number of models out there that are considered, I'd say, good science that people are confident that they can use to predict the future outcomes. So I think that's why you get a lot of mallards and monarchs, because the Fish and Wildlife Service has a model that everybody plugs their stuff into that you can get that kind of stuff. I don't think there's a good model out there for, for white-tailed deer, especially if you're trying to predict white-tailed deer response when the habitat is so varied across the state from the Northeast forest to the Southwest prairies. So I think we're getting the best information that we can get based on what data and models are out there for that. I've thought about the idea of having a scale for different things, whether it be, like leverage or matching funds. But then, you get 2 points from $0 to $50,000 and 50,000 to 100, you get more. And after a certain over $1 million, you get 10. But then, you're rewarding the bigger proposers that can actually raise a lot of funds. So is it fair? Is it not fair? I don't know. So those are the kind of things that I think about. But I think from just getting the amount of information that we get now and whether or not it's enough, I think as of right now, it's enough that I feel comfortable with it. I think a lot of the questions too are, as Mark said, responding to different issues that come up legislatively that we just don't have a way of getting it unless we ask it now in the very beginning. But I feel pretty good about where we're at. I think we can obviously change things around and probably condense a few things, but I don't ever feel like after reading a proposal wondering what are they doing and why are they doing it. So that's the good thing.
So
The only other thing that I have to add really is a lot of the questions that are under the activity details section of the proposal kind of all align with requirements in 97A. So some of those questions are really helpful for staff. We can pull system reports to see if there's any outliers and aren't going to be able to make those requirements. So that's the only thing that I have to comment on regarding that.
Sandy, you were breaking up a little. I think you were saying that the questions actually give staff the ability to understand the proposal fairly well.
Yeah, the questions under the activity details section, some of those, directly align with the requirements in 97A. So then we can pull a quick report and just kind of see if there's any outliers. With those, but I see what you guys mean by, question 3 to and 5 kind of are confusing and sometimes the same. The other thing too that's been helpful for staff is we get calls sometimes from reporters, and they're like, oh, you know, what proposals did you do that, well, you know, affect like the Topeka Shine or whatever, and we were able to really quickly go into the system and do a word search. So it pulls from some of those data boxes, so that's kind of a helpful thing to have too.
Mark?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and members. So a couple of things that come to mind for me, just to throw them to you again, a little more feedback is like number 7 is proposal outcomes will be maintained over time. And oftentimes we as staff, or at least I have questions of, well, how are they going to be maintained? Who's going to be maintaining them? Do they really have the ability to do that, et cetera? So I'm wondering if just the question for you, the council, should be more, is rationale appropriately laid out that explains that the proposal outcomes will be maintained over time, or adding to those questions a little more so that the program manager realizes I can't just put down the facts here. I got to explain how this is going to happen. And the next one too is degree of timing / opportunistic urgency. That's the category number 8. But should it really be more worded like, I hear you talking about rewording some of these questions. So I'm thinking, should it be reworded more like, does the proposal adequately explain the degree of timing and opportunistic urgency? From a new member coming in, and maybe Dudley, you can answer this one as well as anybody. By expounding on that question a little more in that effect, would that be easier for you all to answer it as well?
Yeah, I was just, my comment was going to say that for me, with grading proposals 1, 7, 8, and 9 are big for me in terms of deciding who gets money, when, where, you know, whatever. And certainly Ashley really clued me in on on 8 at one of our last meetings, just understanding. I mean, if that question isn't answered, 8, if it isn't answered in a way that sounds like I need money yesterday, then maybe we should, you know, give someone else some of that money. Because what I also found out at our last meetings, a lot of times people have tens of millions of dollars they haven't spent yet. And so the urgency question is important. And so maybe somehow in question 8, figuring out, you know, the degree of timing and urgency, and then, yeah, like Mark said, you know, reword it a little bit so we get a better answer. And maybe even in that answer, to some degree, it's like, well, how much money have you not spent? So I don't know, but yeah, we could, I think that question 8 could give, you know, be a little expanded, and maybe we get an answer that really helps us answer that question. But again, 1, 7, 8, and 9 are really important to me when I'm looking at, you know, funding.
I would have slightly different ones, but I think it's important that we're all comfortable with the ones that do mean something staying in. Kristen?
Well, I was going to say, you know, my impression of number 7, I got a little confused by what you said, Mark, about changing the wording for 7. And maybe I've been doing it wrong, but when I think about the proposal outcomes will be maintained over time, I look at, are they going to have funding in the future to continue this work and not coming to us? You know, how are they going to be able to do it? So I look at what the work they're doing, but I also look at how can they do it without continually asking us for money? And so maybe I've been like scoring that one wrong, and you know, maybe I've been misunderstanding what that means. So it would be good to be more specific, if just so it's clear.
So just to bring this discussion around. Oh, Ashley, you've got something, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two things quickly. One, to build off what Kristen just said, one of the other things I think about future, like ability to continue the work in future is also the stability of the organization, the perceived stability of that organization and their leadership. I take that into account as well. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention quickly is that when people propose more than one thing and they're asking for a lot of money, it would be helpful to understand what their actual priority is within the organization. If they had to choose one over the other, or if I choose one project to fund more than the other, it would be helpful to understand within an organization what their priority is. So if they're proposing 2, 3, 4, 5, in some cases, different projects or part of different proposals, how does that tie into an organization's priorities? So those were the two things that I just wanted to mention.
Yeah, that one's a tough one for me, because if a proposer has multiple geographies or focuses, asking them to say, I like this geography more than that geography, I think that's a tough thing to do. I think, the Nature Conservancy works in the Southeast and they work in the prairies. Do you want them to say, we wish we could only work in the Southeast versus doing the work in the prairies, just because they're a big organization and they have two different project areas? I think that could get us into a pickle myself. Please, Ashley.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I understand what you're saying, and I certainly understand the complexities there. I guess I'm just getting it on the record that it is one of the challenges with going through these proposals, is knowing that a singular organization gets $20 to $30 million and other organizations get maybe $1 million. Granted, if you're asking for more, you're probably going to get more, but it's just a consideration that I have in mind when I'm thinking about actually making recommendations for allocations. And we don't really have anything in the criteria to help us understand priorities within an organization. So totally understand. We don't necessarily need to do anything about it, but I just wanted to bring it up since we're having this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mark.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, two things. First of all, just kind of in response to a sideline from Ashley's comments, is that sometimes we have certain organizations who are kind of the only shop in town, like MLT is primarily the only easement operation around. They're the only ones willing to buy and hold easements, other than, of course, Bowser or DNR. And so oftentimes they're the one that people go to. I don't know of any others really in the state that like to hold easements from a nonprofit standpoint or not an NGO standpoint. The other question I had is more just nuts and bolts for this. Years ago, it was that the criteria had different scorings. Some were 5 points, some were 10 points, some were 15. And then it came down to, well, maybe we should just make all of them 1 to 10, or all of them 10 points maximum. Is there an interest or not to, and I don't know the answer to, I don't know what would be best, but is there an interest or not, or is there a need to have a larger than 10 maximum points, or to have different levels of grading depending on the question? And that's just an open-ended question for you.
I remember the differential scoring, and it was very hard. I think the leverage question, we had a 1 to 5, where others we had 1 to 15. And for me, leverage was very important, and I felt like it was underappreciated in a 1 to 5 scoring. we could certainly go through each of these and say, how important is it? But at some level, if it's not important, maybe we shouldn't be scoring it. And maybe we need 5 questions and they each get 20 points instead of 10 questions, each getting 10. If collectively we end up feeling that would give us the answers that we need. So, we got half an hour left. I want to, before we end this, I'd like to at least attempt to go through the 2 documents and see if there are areas that we need to highlight as needing attention versus not needing attention. I think we've gotten to the point where we're going to have staff do a survey. I'm going to ask everybody to try to revise the criteria in your own words. So when we come back, we can look at alternatives for that criteria. But I'd like to at least go through the proposals a little, or the actual call for funding and the other document that I can't remember the name of right now, and highlight any areas that are concerning, or the actual proposal that comes back, and see if people have thoughts about those. Is that okay with everyone? All right. Maybe we'll go call for funding first. Anyone have comments there that they'd like to throw out? Areas they'd like to point to?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I just comment that I think when we talk about inclusion and diversity, this is probably the area where we could reach the most folks and bring in the most interest when it comes to putting proposals. So just a thought that if we want to talk further about looking at what we're doing now and how successful it is at getting different groups interested, especially groups that have traditionally not been engaged in this process, I feel like that's in and of itself kind of its own, not initiative, but it's that's something that could be looked at even more. So I guess I'm just offering that I'm happy to help brainstorm some additional ways to do some outreach and make sure that folks are seeing that call for the proposal.
Great. So I would just say on the call itself, I highlighted some things. Successful applicants have to have a minimum of 500,000, doesn't have a dollar sign in it, Mark. And we don't, this is another thing we asked. Look at point 2 under the successful applicants must request a minimum of 500,000. It doesn't say $500,000.
Oh, okay. The dollar sign.
We don't, it says be current with all reporting requirements for Outdoor Heritage Fund appropriations, and we don't ask them to answer that question.
Okay.
We're saying they have to do it, but we don't answer the question. We don't ask the question anywhere. Then on the proposal requirements, provide an up-to-date external financial audit or equivalent. Do we actually get that? I've certainly never seen that.
Some of these things are administrative things that we collect in the online system that are available for you, but we don't make them as part of the application packet. And the previous comment about are they up to date? That's kind of always part of my status update report. Is that would be the way in which the council will be notified of anyone who wasn't up to date with their reporting.
Okay, but wouldn't we want them to acknowledge that they're up to date?
Yeah, we can add a question.
It certainly would make them notice it more, because I certainly know people have applied when they're not up to date. And do we know, has everyone always given us the financial audit or equivalent, Sandy?
Yeah, it's a requirement in the system for NGO applicants.
So if they don't, the proposal doesn't go forward?
Yeah, you won't be able to hit the submit button.
Okay. Then there's criteria 12, requirement. Request a realistic monetary amount given the stated scope and time frame. We know we're not getting realistic monetary amounts. We know people are gaming the system. They're asking for far more money because they know they're going to be cut down. I don't have an answer for this, but I think it's worthy of a future discussion.
Mr. Chair, what about that as a yes or no question from the standpoint for the council too?
That's a good suggestion.
Wouldn't have to be scored from a number standpoint, but it would give you a, you know, did they really feel this is realistic, or at least they're going to be understanding that they're going to be asked.
I don't have any problem with that. So we're going to, at our December meeting, talk about proposal extensions. Are we all comfortable with the amount of time we're giving everyone to work with this funds? You know, acquisition funds, 4 years to actually spend the money. Do we think that we should be giving people 4 years to spend the money? Do we want shovel-ready projects? I ask that question because we're tying up money that isn't going into the ground for a long time by doing that. I understand restoration work takes a period of years, but is it the right amount of time? I only ask the question for us to think about. Those were my questions on the actual call for funding request. Were there others that other people had? Josh?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, you just asked a question about the timeline and 4 years. And are we comfortable with that? And I would say, I don't think anybody should be. I think that we're appropriating money for a project that is 4 years is, as you said, a very long time. On the other side of the coin, it's hard to ask sellers to hang on while I go apply to the Lessard-Sams. So we've created our own monster because no assurance that, you know, a applier for dollars is going to get it. I don't know if anyone here is equipped to answer that question, considering that we've created the problem and it seems like the long timeline has been the only solution. We're probably gonna be able to have a long conversation about this if we really wanted to address it.
What does staff think on that? Mark, you've got your hand up. Good.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, figuring out what the sweet spot is for the timeline has always been, I think, a question that staff and council have asked. And from a practitioner standpoint, in a little bit, I'll ask Joe to put in his comments too, because he's been out doing that work on the other side of the ledger book here. I mean, not now, but previously. So he's got practical experience there too. It's different for acquisition versus restoration enhancement. And if you acquire the land and then you're going to restore it and enhance it, there's accommodations for that. And Joe can go into that as well. But what I was going to mention was that when you look at the timeline, as Representative Heinzman brought up, and I won't talk about acquisition in fee, but from an easement standpoint, a lot of the time, of course, they don't know if they're going to get funding ahead of time. So whether it's Bowser, MLT, or somebody else, they have to go out and talk to the landowner, convince them, or at least find ones that are interested. And sometimes they have certain criteria, like it'll be almost a lowest bid from a standpoint like MLT does. They'll put out their RFP, and if the landowner is interested in having an easement done on the property, then they say, well, what are they willing to accept for that? Does it have to be actual, so to speak, retail value, or are they less willing to take less than that, and so on? So it takes a while for them to work through those criteria to figure out who are the best ones for the easement from a price standpoint, but more importantly, who are the best ones for an easement from a habitat standpoint and a sensitivity of the property or sensitivity of the species. Now, Joe, maybe you want to add a couple of comments from a standpoint of just the timeline and so on from a practitioner standpoint.
Mr. Chair and members, I think 4 years is a pretty, I mean, it'd be better if you could get acquisitions done sooner. I think whether it's 3 or 4 years is probably not a huge issue. I think the most important part is just making sure that after the parcel is acquired, that they have time to do the actual restoration and actually get habitat out there, because you're buying the parcel to provide the habitat. And sometimes, you know, there's not habitat there, and we don't want to be in a situation where we're buying something and not providing, you know, that end product of quality habitat that's providing fish, wildlife, and habitat for fish and game, just like, you know, the Constitution requires. So I think if we shorten the amount of time for acquisition, I still think that we want to be flexible in the amount of time that we're providing for the restoration, because that's probably the most important part. I think overall, I don't know if we see a huge amount of funding coming back to the fund because folks aren't spending their acquisition money. I think if we saw a lot of money coming back, then we would have addressed that at some point, and trying to figure out, you know, why are we getting all this money back because people aren't spending it. So I don't think that that's broken. You know, I think if we shorten the amount of time we have to buy land, that folks will request less just because they don't want to send money back. Because if they look bad, theoretically, then the council will, you know, look and say, hey, you still have $20 million and you sent back, you know, $10 million last year, we're not going to fund you. So I think even though there's no real formal checks and balances, I think there are checks and balances out there that, you know, make sure everybody's doing what they said they're going to do. So I don't know, I think it's okay. Right now, I don't see, like I said, I haven't seen really any major issues with anybody giving a lot of money back. So because of that, I just can't say it's broken. I think it's probably working pretty well.
Mr. Chair, Sandy might have some comments too from a system standpoint. We have been seeing, as you know, some more extensions coming through, and some of those are COVID related. Sometimes it's other stuff, but Sandy, do you have any comments from that standpoint?
No, I agree with what Joe said. Not really a problem. We don't see a lot of big money coming back. You know, what we do is usually a one-off project for something very specific that may or may not have worked out the way that they thought. So it's hard to say. We've had so many extensions the last couple of years that I think we'll have a better sense of things moving forward here when we stop with all the COVID extensions and we see what people can really get done in the time period they have.
And Mr. Chair, and I just comment too, that I think a lot of the issues that we do see when it comes to acquisitions are the proposals that have a very specific project. And it's, it's a one-off, we want to buy this specific parcel, instead of the programs where it's going to, like, say, Pheasants Forever, where they're buying waterfowl production areas in a big program where they've always got proposals coming in and going out. They're always working on multiple parcels at a time, where I think a lot of the issue is where there's a proposal for one specific parcel, and if that parcel doesn't go through or something happens, then they're sending money back because they don't have a backup plan, because it's so specific to that one parcel.
Well, I bring it up because I don't have the issue with restoration as much as acquisition. And I think of Bowser acquiring easements, and they just don't seem to get the job done. And they're always, spending right before the deadline. You wonder if the deadline were sooner, if they'd still be spending to meet the deadline. If we've got their full attention with this money, because if someone else could be spending it to get results, that's where I'd rather spend it. So I asked the question, maybe it's fine. Depends on how others feel. So let's move on to the proposal report that we get, or the request that we get in. I have a number of comments. Do others have comments on these? I'll run through mine then quickly. We've already talked about criteria 1 under the design and scope of work, which is, does the proposal address habitats that have significant value for wildlife species of greatest conservation need, threatened or endangered species, and list targeted species? We need a better answer than we've been getting. Which 2 sections of the Minnesota statewide conservation and preservation plan are most applicable to this project? And then we ask for 2 more after that. I don't see any value in that. If I go to indicator species, we've had that discussion. There's a question under activity details on page 5. Is the land you plan to acquire easement free of any other permanent protection? And then there's a describe the expected public use. I don't think that fits under that place. Public use has nothing to do with permanent protection. The next question, will restoration and enhancement work follow best management practices, including MS 84973 pollinator protect habitat program? I've never seen anyone say no, but maybe they will. I'm not sure. It's a great question. Is this land currently open to hunting and fishing under land use on page 6? Why are we just saying hunting and fishing? If we're talking about public access, it should be more than just for hunting and fishing. Is it open for hunting, fishing, hiking, biking, whatever it is, the criteria? But it seems limiting to me to just talk about hunting and fishing. Then I struggle under the budget with what professional services is. Everybody uses that differently, and I get confused by it. Is it acquisition services? Is it restoration services? Is it design services? I'd like to see a description of what professional services are. And I thought we had it somewhere, and then I went and looked and I couldn't find it, so maybe I'm missing it. But I get tripped up on professional services in these proposals when I read them. I also get tripped up when people include restoration in the cost of acquisition. And I think it ought to be clearly delineated that this is what it requires to acquire the property and this is what it requires to restore it. Instead of letting people put when they're transferring it to a WMA, they tend to sometimes include the cost of restoration in the cost of acquisition. And I'd like to see it for sure broken out. And the same is true with the travel line. People are, the DNR uses travel line to cover their cost of equipment, and maybe we should have them put in the budget true travel cost and true equipment and vehicle rental instead of a single thing that they lump it into and just confuse us. It's very hard to ask a follow-up question when it's lumped together. Those were my questions in the actual proposal that comes back to us. Did that spark any thoughts with others or things that I missed? Dudley?
I was just going to say, I pretty much agree with everything you said in terms of, some of the questions and the way they're worded and how they could, particularly the one expanding, use, and it shouldn't just be hunting and fishing. It should be, bird watching, hiking, all of that stuff should be included. Because we do have a large, base of Minnesota taxpayers, and everybody doesn't do those activities. So I guess really what I'm saying is I agree with everything you said. So.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Sandy.
I would just say that some of the questions under activity details are triggered by what activity you're doing. So the hunting and fishing questions are triggered if you're doing fee title acquisition. So those questions wouldn't show up if you aren't doing that activity in your proposal.
Okay.
It's asked because of requirement in law.
Joe?
Mr. Chair and members, not to throw a wrench into anything, but I don't know if you've noticed, but over the last year, maybe two, some programs have been planting different species outside of what I would consider their normal range in preparation for things changing with climate change. And so, we do have this requirement that, we have to restore the land to the most local ecotype. And now we're kind of moving away from that to planting, let's say, oaks in Northeast Minnesota. So I just think we should probably discuss that at some point and try and figure out, are we okay changing this, and do we want to call it local ecotype, or it's just kind of a new thing that's changing that we probably should think about and respond to.
It'd be an interesting question to ask. If you're not going to use local ecotype, why? There may be a very good reason for it, but we should be aware of it. Josh?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think Joe raises a good point of conversation. It may be of interest to an applicant to begin preemptively making an adjustment to their selection of plants, trees, etc. But does that necessarily match the science? And is that a wise investment of taxpayer dollars if we're planting, the example was oaks in northeastern Minnesota, and they all die? It may have made somebody feel like they were making a proper adjustment, but if that doesn't match the actual conditions in that particular area, and we have a loss of investment, it's, I think, important for us to consider that. So I'm glad we're talking about it today, and I think that it should be a concern if we're making investments that are going to wind up not benefiting the public.
Dudley?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm understanding Joe's question in that, are we talking about basically in some organizations' efforts to get ahead of climate change, they're planting trees that are traditionally or untraditionally supposed to be on the North Shore? I mean, of course, white pines and cedars and things like that, and birch are supposed to be here, but as the climate changes, maybe the habitat is more, favoring more oaks and maples and things like that. So are you saying that funding non-traditional planting of trees is something we need to, or habitat or whatever, that we need to look at and try to, make sure that that's the right thing to do? I guess I'm trying to understand the question.
I think the question is probably about, are people jumping ahead and are we aware of it? But Joe, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and members, for the longest time, we've required that everybody use local ecotype as local as they possibly can, spending a lot of money trying to go and harvest seed maybe from 20 miles away instead of getting it from 100 miles away. And now, whether it's right or wrong, I don't have an opinion, but it's now, that's kind of breaking the requirements that we've had, and maybe, not getting local ecotype, but maybe if you're in the prairie planting species, for example, from Iowa in Minnesota instead of local because of whatever happens with climate change. So it's making sure that our requirements in our RFP and what we require them to actually do in the restoration follows, with what the best science is at the time, or what that is now. And it could be changed, and we just want to make sure that everybody knows what those rules and requirements are.
All right, we're out of time. Mark, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the next steps would be, number one, the confidential survey of applicants to get some feedback. Number two, ask council members to take a shot ask the committee members. Josh, I'm going to include you even though you didn't sign up for the committee, to look at the scoring systems and adjust the language in ways that make sense to you, or add questions or delete questions and submit that before our next meeting to Mark so that he can circulate that. And number three, ask the staff to make some draft adjustments to the two documents based on the feedback we've given them for us to at least discuss. Mark, can you live with that?
There we go. Sorry. Yes, Mr. Chair. The last one you said was sending a draft feedback.
Take the feedback you've gotten on the two documents and make some draft changes or create a document that shows some changes for everyone to review and decide at the next meeting if that reflects what our collective thinking is or not.
Gotcha.
So we can discuss that.
And that's the collective meeting of this committee.
Of
correct?
this committee.
Okay.
Yep.
And then, so along with that, Mr. Chair, do you want to suggest a meeting date, or should we try to poll everybody and see what we have coming up?
We're all here. A meeting date wouldn't be a bad thing. What about the week before Thanksgiving or after Thanksgiving?
Thanksgiving is on the 24th, correct, this year?
Yep,
As normal.
it is.
I would suggest after, just my thoughts. The election cycle is incredibly busy, and it'd be nice to have a little break for families.
How about the 29th?
Tuesday, the 29th? See
Yep.
one thumb up,
I don't like
one
it.
thumb down, two thumbs down, three thumbs down.
That's fine. What
Any
about
other-
the 6th? The 6th of December.
Representative Heinzman, I see a note on my calendar. It's tentative, so it might be an old note, but it said new House member orientations. Is that going to affect you, or maybe they've changed that date and this is an old note?
I only have a short role in new member orientations, but thank you for mentioning that. That could have been a disruption, but Krisha will have that primarily.
All right. So I see that was Tuesday, December 6th. We had thumb up, thumb up, thumb up. All thumbs up.
All right. 8:30? $8:30 work?
Looks like.
Nobody's saying no.
9:30
plan
was
on it.
really nice today, Mr. Chair.
What was?
Today's meeting
9:30?
time was really nice.
I'm fine with 9:30. (9:30) on the 6th it is. Plan on 90 minutes again, if you would.
Very good.
All right. Thank you all. Appreciate your time today and the input. I think we've made a little progress. It's great.
Thank you.
All
Thanks,
right. We'll
Mr.
see
Chair
you
and
all.
members.
All right.
Take care.